Hey everybody, this is Cory Nakasue, and welcome to the Cosmic Dispatch. I'm here today with Camille Michelle Gray, and we're going to talk about the upcoming Gemini season. And I say upcoming because we are recording this today on May 18th at 11:08 a.m. So it's a few days off, but it's a major tonal shift from this like super heavy Taurus season that we've had. Very different energy, and then we have a really big um, uh, placement change coming up on May 25th. Jupiter is entering Gemini, and so we're going to give some special attention to that too. We have some friends joining us, and they're staggering in kind of in true like Gemini
Gemini
fashion.
form. Yeah.
People coming and going, adding to the conversation. So we're going to have multiple voices, which is what I really wanted to do today. Before we get started and before Camille introduces herself, I just want to remind you that if you like this content, please follow us. You can like or subscribe, follow. You can check us out on social media, but social media is really just an extension of like if we had a website, just to keep up to date when episodes are coming out, or if any of the contributors who or guests who are on the show have things going on, we'll usually, pop something up on social media. But otherwise, just follow us on whatever platform you listen to for your podcasts, or you can follow us on YouTube. And what else? If you are new to this show, I'm Cory. I am a Hellenistic and modern based astrologer. I've studied a lot of psychological astrology and evolutionary astrology. I have a body practice called Body Intelligence that I've been running for about 25 years. And so I mix principles of embodiment and somatic movement with the astrology. And you can check out my website for more information on my offerings and my different practices at astrologybycory.com. And a couple things I have coming up, as far as my books, they're open. I can see a handful of people in June. Things are slowing down for me a little bit. And also, before I forget, next week I will be at the Northwest Astrology Conference virtually. Sam Reynolds just sent me an email, and they're sponsoring me this year. So
Congrats.
if you are attending virtually, or I don't know, maybe even in person, if you see this face in a little box, come say hi. I'm not sure how socializing is going to work um virtually, but say hi. I'll be there. And also I have some new stuff coming up. I'm in talks, and this is really interesting and very kind of Jupiter and Gemini. I'm in talks with a psychotherapy practice here in Kingston, New York, and they're they have astrologers in their psychotherapy practice, which I think is really interesting. And so I might be doing a workshop this summer. We're deciding on what that workshop will be, but also you'll be able to book private sessions with me. They're counseling sessions, but using astrology. And just to be clear, astrology is not therapy, but it's a different practice, but it is therapeutic. And I think it's really interesting that therapists are open to taking these types of practices on board in the hopes of having, different offerings. Different things work for different people. And so I think it's really cool that you'll be able to find astrology where you might usually go for your talk therapy practice as either an adjunct practice or to just try something different. So if you are interested in that type of thing coming up, you can follow me on Instagram at Body Intel. And I really just use social media to kind of post whatever's new, whatever new things I'm doing. And also, just another word about like astrology and psychotherapy. I'm not saying, wow, this is awesome, because somehow the institution of talk therapy and psychology gives some kind of legitimacy to astrology. It Astrology is legitimate in its own right. It is its own thing. But what I think is cool about it is that by being able to find astrology in different places like this, where it's, more socially acceptable to go and talk to somebody, it it opens up opportunities to use your mind in a different way, to look at your life in a different way, to relate to another person, whoever your counselor or therapist or consultant might be. So yeah, that's I think that's all I'm up to astrology wise coming up in the next month or so. Um, yeah, I think that's everything. So I'm going to hand it off to Camille Michelle Gray. If you would introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi Corey. It's nice to be back. I am Camille. A little bit about the astrology I practice. So I also do a blended thing. Maybe it's a Gemini thing. So I am an evolutionary astrologer, but I base a lot of my techniques in Hellenistic doctrine, and I use a lot of the traditional astrology with the evolutionary astrology. You can find me at CamilleMichelleGray.com. My books are always open, so if you see a date and a time that works for you, come on by. I don't have anything coming up in the next month or two, but I am speaking at my first astrology conference this year. So big Jupiter and Gemini vibes here to be giving a talk. And that will be the Astro Bash Conference, Evolutionary Astrology Conference in Borrego Springs at the end of September and into October. So if it's in your budget and you want to come through to the desert of California, it's a great place to be, and I would love to meet folks.
That's awesome, Camille.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
If if you didn't say so already, may I ask what your talk centers on?
I don't know yet.
Okay. All right.
Also, in typical Gemini fashion, maybe my best work is done at the 11th hour. I have some ideas circulating, but I don't want to like put them out there yet because they're not congealed. So it'll be TBD.
Oh, well, I will have that on my radar. That's so cool. I'm so excited for you.
Thank you.
So this is a Gemini show, and
Mhm.
both Camille and I and the guests that are going to be filing in later, we all have Gemini placements. And my Gemini street cred is I have Mars and Saturn in Gemini, and they're in might as well be an exact
Mhm.
conjunction. And that Mars in Gemini has jurisdiction over my luminaries. So Mars in Gemini is taking care of my sun, it's taking care of my moon, it's taking care of my Mercury, and we'll throw Chiron in there as well. So Mars in Gemini is governing a lot. And because it sits so tightly with Saturn, also whatever houses are ruled by Saturn, it's not just ruled by Saturn. Mars has his hands in there too, guiding those those houses that are governed by Saturn. And so I feel very influenced by that Mars in Gemini energy. How about you, Camille?
I too have Mars and Gemini in my first house, so a Gemini ascendant and Mars in Gemini. I also feel the influence of Mars very heavily just because it's in my first house and it can direct and see where it's going, very angular and very loud. So yeah, that's my Gemini street cred.
Okay, we are going to be talking some more
Yeah.
about the yeah, the individual placements and how they're experienced and some things we might be contending with this
Mhm.
season. Um, and so the sun enters Gemini on May 20th. And um, I kind of see Gemini as like, among many things, it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of the signs, like flexible, adaptable, multivalent, um, movable. I often think that Gemini isn't so much, we think in multiples, but I tend not to think about it as like the points, all the different points in discrete facts or things in space, but because of the rulership of Mercury, it's the movement in between all those discrete points
Mhm.
and how all these disparate things might be connected. And so yeah, so much to talk about. And again, a big tonal shift. We like as we're talking, we are in Taurus season. And actually on this day, May 18th, we have some like huge Taurus transits that are like happening right now as we speak. We're getting a Jupiter Cazimi today. I don't think it's happened quite yet in that last degree of Taurus. And we just had a Venus Uranus conjunction around 23 degrees of Taurus, but it's like all happening today. It's like they're doing their like final Taurus,
Yeah.
like whatever to the max before we shift into this very movable um, time in Gemini, and Taurus is not that.
Mm.
um, so yeah, what are some things you think about when you think about Gemini season, Camille?
Well, I happen to think that the transfer from Taurus to Gemini is one of the starkest kind of comparisons between signs because we go from fixed Earth, which is the most solid something can be, to mutable air, which is the most dispersible and invisible that things can be. But when I think about Gemini season, my favorite word to use just for Gemini generally is like pollination and cross pollination. So, kind of like getting out there, sampling different things, leaving your ideas or your impression behind on all these like discrete, smaller places, you know, fertilizing your ideas by getting out there in your environment. And just, it's kind of this playtime in a lot of ways. I feel like when we move from Taurus to Gemini, because there's just so much possible and there's so much flex and there's just so much interest when Gemini gets kind of like highlighted in the chart. And I think that can be a fun, chaotic but fun energy to be in.
Yeah. Just with what you were saying about like pollinating, the first
Mhm.
thing that came to mind were like bees and
Mhm.
butterflies, right?
Yeah.
Just sampling all the goods, kind of flirting with all the plants.
I love that flirting. Yes.
Yeah, right. There's the flirting aspect of Gemini, not committing, but
Yeah.
like I'm gonna sample that. I'm gonna sample that. Because again, because of all I think Geminis need to connect the dots and draw lines between things. There needs to be multiple things. There can't just be a point of focus, which is very much Taurus. um, I used to live in the city for 15 years, which means like small New York City for 15 years, which means small spaces, small apartments. And then I finally moved upstate, and now I have a house and I have outside space. And when I first moved here, I used to host these full moon parties. And I remember distinctly, it would always be like so funny that each party would take on the character of the season like so literally.
Interesting.
So like I would have when I had full moon Taurus party, um, we'd all be surrounded around this table and everyone like brought way too much food and there'd be like this mountain of food and drink around the table and we just would stay there and sit at the table and pretty soon people are kind of like leaning on each other, giving each other little back rubs. I think a couple people fell asleep or took a nap like, and
Oh
it
my
was
god.
just, it was condensed and nobody moved. And then I had a full moon in Gemini party and people were coming into the house, leaving the house, coming in the house, leaving the house. There was a group of two here, a group of three there, and then they'd switch and they'd fragment. And it was like, oh my God, this is like too literal.
Yeah,
But that's kind of the difference that you were speaking of, like Taurus moving into Gemini. And so I think
absolutely.
and we're going to have another one of these big clusters as we've been having all year with like 4 or 5 planets in each sign. So you're getting um, like a really, you're getting kind of assaulted with that sign's energy
Yeah.
every season until it starts to separate. With Gemini, I'm also thinking just to like kind of start getting you in the Gemini headspace. I think of things like bifurcation, and it's really evident in the body and the body parts that Gemini rules. For instance, it's like when you start coming down the body, especially after the throat, Taurus, it bifurcates into two shoulders, two lungs, and then you get down to two hands, and then it bifurcates again into 5 digits, which, with Gemini, it keeps there's like little
Wintering.
tributaries
Yeah.
and arteries that things keep breaking off into from the source. So I think of that, but I also think of synthesis, where you're taking all these pieces again, everything that's been separated or fragmented, and trying to sew them together so they can somehow work in tandem.
Mhm.
And so I think we'll be talking about some of those things. Also, truth versus facts, which the two are different.
Yes. I was like, "Wait a minute. Oh, no, you got me." Yeah, that makes sense.
They're different. So I think we're going to talk about some of that because that could get very confusing and also very interesting. Um, yeah, I think as we go on, the rest will speak for itself. How about you, Camille? Any other things that like Gemini conjures for you, or you think will be hitting a lot as the season goes on?
Well, I guess my first thought is maybe a classic Aquarius, like subversion. That's where my sun is. It's like Gemini is known for being kind of like uncommitted, but paradoxically, Gemini is committed to curiosity in all of like the random places that that curiosity ends up taking them. So there is, even in this very, discrete and non-linear way, a kind of commitment to just exploring the mind and the things that pique interest and the things that are fascinating. And one of the one of the ideas or two of the ideas I've been using a lot recently with Gemini energy is like tangents and side quests, right? So we have like the overall mission, which is like, I need to get this, go to there, pass over the bridge with the troll, and then I save the princess, whatever, and I'm done. But Gemini is more so this feeling of like, oh, there's like a side quest over here, go collect some berries, right? It's just like this random thing. But I feel like in doing that, kind of like as you said with Mercury, Gemini is able to like get into these nooks and crannies of the environment, right? And kind of pick up these clues or pieces of information that don't feel like they're going to cohere to like an overall narrative or the overall mission, but it ends up just being like this interesting way that Gemini like garnishes its existence with all these little tidbits of information and how that can make a meal like a little bit more interesting and diverse. I'm using food analogies as we're under this very heavy Taurus energy. So very classic classic there, but, yeah, but those are the ideas that really come to mind, and part of that is born out of my own existential angst about, like, "Am I really that distracted? Am I really that scattered, or is there actually some kind of uniform, mission to just learn as much and explore as much as possible?"
I love all that. I feel all that. Totally relate to all of that.
Yeah.
And then we have our first other guest trickling in. Hey, Mandee.
Hey,
Hi.
hi.
Um, Camille and Mandee, have you met
We've
formally?
we've not formally, but on the internet. Yeah.
We chat back and forth. We have a Gemini exchange that we
Yeah.
do that, yeah, yeah.
Well, welcome, Mandee.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself, please, for our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm Mandee Sheeler. That's all I like, that's all I've got, Corey. I'm an astrologer, I'm a mom. Yeah, I've kind of been focusing on solo practice a lot these days. So I am an astrologer and I have consulted in the past and I will do so again. And I'll continue. I do write, but I'll share again. But right now yeah, I'm here.
Yeah.
Well, that's very Aries of you, Mandee. I'm here.
I'm
I'm
here.
Mandee. Bam.
And that's enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Camille.
Heck
Yeah,
yeah.
that's been yeah, it is enough.
Mm.
So yeah, getting some, as Camille reminded us, also around this weekend, we have Mars in Aries, conjoining the North Node in Aries. So all the Aries stuff that happened in April is like, it's not gone yet.
Mhm.
And Gemini and Aries work really well together. Sometimes to a troubling degree. I have tons of Geminis around me, and I have a lot of Aries. And the effect that I feel is basically whatever I'm like, hey, let's do this. I want to do this, or I have an idea. I want to start this. Gemini, they fan the flames, and then all they do is actually like give it more energy, which can be good, but it can also be like, woo, can be a little over the top, but but not boring,
Yeah.
and fun. So glad to have you here, Mandee. We are just about to talk about the first big event of Gemini season, which is the full moon in Sagittarius. And this one is so interesting because it makes a trine to Pluto in Aquarius, another big voice in the larger astrological picture, um, for a long time, for some time to come. And also, that happens on May 23rd, but that full moon is just so huge to me, not just because it's in Sagittarius and it's trining Pluto, but on the very same day, Venus and Jupiter form a conjunction at the 29th degree of Taurus, which is where we're getting a lot of our Taurus action today on this recording day at that very end of Taurus. And also on that day, right after Venus and Jupiter make that conjunction at 29 degrees Taurus, Venus slips right into Gemini. Um, and so, given all of that, um, any comments for that full moon or Venus and Jupiter conjunction, the whole thing on May 23rd?
Yeah, when I was thinking about it, the kind of idea that came to mind was underworld adventures because Pluto is forming a sextile to the moon, and then it's trining the sun in Gemini. And so it's kind of like this more fruitful, supportive energy that Pluto is giving us. And, whenever Sagittarius is highlighted, I just think of adventures or the great mythic quest when it comes to Sagittarius. And so I'm curious around like that Sagittarius full moon, like what treasures perhaps are buried in this Plutonian underworld, remembering that it's ruled by this super, super benefic Jupiter Venus conjunction in Taurus. It makes me think of like, well, what's underneath this thing you haven't dusted off, like an Indiana Jones,
Yeah.
like what's in this treasure chest?
Mm.
And it could be like an integral, plot point or piece of whatever an ongoing Pluto journey that you may be on, like psychologically or soul-based or spiritually. So those were my thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
same.
same.
Yeah,
There's something about that, that Venus Jupiter conjunction at the 29th degree of
yeah,
Taurus that really suggests to me like over the top, which
yeah,
you already have with a full moon in Sagittarius. Um, so yeah, like I'm thinking that whatever our larger questions are or our stories are, they're either going to be, hugely bountiful and materialize in some kind of tangible, benefic way, or they might be so blown out of all proportion that we might be a little bit deluded about something, or the hopes we have, like let's say it's this side quest
Mhm.
or an actual the quest, whatever our hopes or ambitions are for that journey or for that undertaking are going to be somehow exaggerated, or we can have an exaggerated sense of our own abilities to accomplish things. Um, not to pour water on this like big, bounty of
yeah.
stuff. Uh, but I see it could go that way. And the sun is newly in Gemini, moon is in Sagittarius. We're dealing with facts and minutia and details and these discrete little things and the big picture and the story. It's like, do the facts support this larger narrative or story, or are we, because it's a Gemini sun, are we messing around with the data? Are we leaving things
Yeah.
out? Are we lying about things in order to support a story where this is where like things like bias or propaganda even might come into
Yes.
play. Um, and what else? What else?
Cory, I had the thought, like dogmatic beliefs was like, so like, yes, Camille, kind of what you were saying about this like underworld adventure, but then becoming so attached
Mhm.
to whatever that belief is. So like this, yeah, my two big thoughts were dogmatic belief, but then also multiple truths being true and holding space for all of that. And that's just really tricky. And
Yeah.
yeah, the dogmatic thing though was kind of the bigger, because Sag, but also Taurus and Venus. And like you were saying, Cory, the Gemini piece, the facts, and because Neptune's, also a little in the picture as well. And so that,
Right.
yeah,
That's
that,
right.
Exact sextile at 29 of Pisces. Mm.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, what's reality?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can't, and so yeah, so I was like, that's like kind of depressing, but then so it's like also if there are multiple truths, like those things have to begin to like overlap at some point, and so maybe we can focus on the overlap and then like, okay, this is where you are, what you think, how you feel, this is what I think and how I feel, but then where do the minutia and the details, I think there's a little bit more similarity there than some of us may realize on the surface.
Well, so Mandy, like when I hear you say, like, how do these things overlap? Like, what do you think? Here's what I think. That's a very Gemini thing. That's engagement.
Yeah,
It's like one side is actually engaging with another side to co-create a
yes.
story or to check. the facts, like literally like check each other on what is true, what are you observing, because that's not what I'm observing, and then come up with maybe a more unified story. And typically Sagittarius doesn't like to do that. It's dogmatic. It's like, I don't need to engage with that. This is what I believe, and I'm in full conviction with this. I will stand behind it. Don't you do your devil's advocate thing with me, right? And try to poke holes in my like beautiful, perfectly constructed truth. And I find that that's another like Gemini Sagittarius dynamic where um, Gemini will question. And questions I think are going to come up some more as we keep talking, questioning the underpinnings of the Sagittarian ideal, principle, their version of the narrative or truth. And that's when, you know, Gemini does Sagittarius a lot of good. Because, you know, Sagittarius is about things like faith as well. And, you know, a lot of, you know, religious arguments will actually end up that I've had a lot of debates about religion with people. And something that comes back a lot is, well, this, you can't question faith. If you're questioning it, then you don't have faith. And that is the whole point, is that there are no answers and you just have to take it on faith, which my Gemini stuff really doesn't like. It's like, no, no, no. We are gonna pick this apart and see how this works. Gemini mechanics. How does this work? Um, and so I'm seeing a lot of that. Or you can manipulate the Gemini stuff to support the Sagittarian belief or truth, which would be something like confirmation bias, only looking at certain facts that will fit into a worldview or belief, which not that's not such a great situation either. Um, so yeah, I mean, like we don't need astrology to tell us that there's a lot of this going on around us like already, and I think it's really going to ramp up during this Gemini season. Um, yeah, any other thoughts on this Gemini Sagittarius situation or the full moon?
The last thought I had is just thinking about how full moons are like culminating events. And, both the ruler of the sun and the ruler of the moon, Jupiter and Mercury, are in Taurus. And it made me kind of think and align with what you two are saying about like what happens when this big truth is revealed and it completely shakes this Taurus foundation that you thought was like super rock solid.
Yeah. Yeah.
um the involvement of Jupiter with Venus, as benefics, it's a mixed bag in terms of good realizations or maybe bad realizations. And okay, even the profound epiphanies are still disorienting, even if they're liberating. But yeah, it's like that interplay between fixed energy and mutable energy, and how, they're very incongruent to one another, and how that can cause a lot of like internal tension or even external tension like out in society.
Mm, yeah, good point. So I think, yeah, as we keep heading into Gemini season, we're really, I think one of our main friends is going to be discernment.
Mm.
Like instead of maybe going off half cocked when we hear certain stories and either like jumping to conclusions and then getting all of our body, mind, heart behind a certain story, like right off the bat, to like say, okay, that is one story. Let me again engage with Gemini. Let me talk to some friends about this and see what they think. Let me do a little research before I align my whole like person behind this story, thought, attitude, idea. Um, which, yeah, I think that might be a saving grace.
And I also think that, Mercury through Taurus is extremely thorough in terms of like, I'm going to ruminate on this thing before I make a conclusion or make some kind of decision. So it ends up being both an energy that can conflict with whatever happens, but also one that can ground, whatever information comes to light. It's like, let me slowly unpack and get to like the essence of whatever this huge Gemini Sag explosion was.
Yeah, good point. And to use that Mercury and Taurus energy before it goes into Gemini
Yes.
as well. So like on the same day as that full moon, and this like possibly extremely gorgeous influence of Venus and Jupiter and Taurus, right after that Venus enters Gemini. And Mandee, I know you're a Venus and Gemini native. What does that feel like to have that placement?
I was thinking about this because you had mentioned it in the email, and it's so simple and so funny, but I often think about, or it made me think about how often I show up here and like either my background is different or something about like my appearance is different. I always have like there's always a variation in what I don't know, my environment or my physical appearance. Um, Growing up, I I wouldn't say I was a tomboy, but the word that people used at the time was androgynous. I always kind of went a little, I was able to pull off the more masculine looks and the more feminine looks. Sometimes I have really short hair, sometimes I have really long hair. And so I think that Gemini Venus thing is really, I like to spice things up and switch things up. And yeah, that's been we'll start there anyways, see if that has anything.
No, I like that you brought in the word androgynous.
Me too. Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I
not,
don't,
yeah,
is that still, yeah, yeah,
it's not femme, it's not mask, and it moves. It
yeah.
moves
Definitely.
between the two, it blends, it synthesizes. So thank you for that account.
Yeah.
We have another friend joining us
I
right
love the
now.
Gemini layout of this, like the format here, Corey. It's
I know
perfect.
it's
I love it. I love it. It's like a little party.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, thank you, Mandee. Yeah, Venus and
Yeah.
Gemini doesn't, yeah, doesn't need to pick.
No.
Mercury has been sometimes, called like not a neuter, but a hermaphrodite.
Mhm.
It's it's
Yeah.
both.
Yeah.
And hello, Shay.
hi.
Hello to all of you. I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome. I'm delighted to have you here. Shay in the Catskills is joining us. Shay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Shea in the Catskills. I am a queer artist and tarotist, living in the town of Shandaken. And I'm just so like geeked out to be in this collection of people. I'm sorry that I missed sort of what came before. Is there a TLDR for me about what you all have had to say
We've
so
just,
far?
yeah, we've been laying the groundwork to talk about Gemini and Gemini season. So we've been discussing our different experiences with Gemini and the many, many different facets, especially of Gemini. And we were just talking about a full moon that happens with many other things on May 23rd. And so that brings us to the next, and this is huge, pun intended, this next huge event in astrology where Jupiter enters Gemini. And it's a huge, I say huge and pun intended because, Jupiter has the reputation for being the magnifying glass, the expander, the inflator. So we're getting some inflation and expansion in all of these subjects that we've been talking about in Gemini. And I have a couple, or I have actually I started with a couple talking points for Jupiter and Gemini, and then my pen kept going. So bear with me. I'm just gonna like bullet point these out. And if any of you like get something from it, we can go a little deeper. Um, but yeah, I just kept, oh, and this and this and this. Um, One of the things we were talking about at the full moon, bringing in the Sagittarius vibe and Jupiter, that's one of the signs that Jupiter rules along with Pisces. Faith and the questions that upend it. That's one. Expanding the question and how the question keeps things alive, which is Gemini, the questions. And a lot of times we think of Sagittarius as, the answer. But when you have an answer, what often ends up happening is it stops thought. It's like, okay, well, there it is. But questions keep things moving, which is another Mercury Gemini thing. Rehashing dominant narratives. That would be like a Jupiterian Sagittarian thing, where, let's say, for instance, the dominant narrative is the world is made for able-bodied people. And so then we have these marginalized groups who sit in chairs with wheels. Like, okay, they're disabled, and there's a story, and we are abled. That's a way to look at things. But if you were to rehash that narrative and say we had a world where everything was ramps and everything was made for people with wheels and they were the majority, then all of a sudden, people would be looking at people who use their legs to walk and being like, oh, actually, you're unwheeled and, you're different. And like reframing things, reframing the narrative. And oppositions. In Gemini, the symbol for Gemini is the twins. So we have two. We always at least have two, if not more, with Gemini. And how we tend to think that it's a boy and girl twin. Whatever is not me, like I recognize as different from me or my opposite, that must be something that I am totally not attached to. When in fact, if you're looking at something across from you, like an opposite, like when we even have a full moon, that is a huge connection. Actually, opposition doesn't mean that, oh, we're so different. It means, oh, actually, we actually contain the other half of each other, or the other half of the story, the other half of the argument, those types of things. This next one, I'm borrowing from Rick Levine. In our brain, we have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. We'd be like, oh, you're right-brained or you're left-brained, and this means this or this means that. But what joins the two hemispheres of the brain is the corpus callosum. That's how the right and left are able to function as like one whole brain. And so I see Gemini as this corpus callosum. It's the mechanism and the motility that enables right and left to be able to work together. I already talked about that. Oh, and something to consider as we continue to talk about Jupiter. On April 20th, Jupiter made a conjunction with Uranus. So this isn't just like some Jupiter in a vacuum doing the textbook Jupiter things. Jupiter just got radicalized by Uranus, and we've been seeing all Taurus season like real life examples of what a radicalized Jupiter does, who just had a meeting with Uranus. And so to take that into account as we keep talking about Jupiter, I'm almost done. Mercury going between the light and dark, right? So Mercury is also the psychopomp. I want to bring that into the conversation. Mercury goes underground and it comes back up. And like Mercury was the only one who could go between worlds like that. And if we were to attach like a string to Mercury as it goes back and forth, up and down between things, it would almost be like it's stitching or sewing together, right? These two things. So again, bringing this whole idea of oppositions not actually being different and actually being the two things that will make something whole, to get like the full picture, two sides of one coin. So I had that idea. Also with Gemini and Mercury, and we've all done this before. There's this idea of what looks good on paper. This is, you know, the practice that we do when we're trying to make a decision and going back and forth. And we'll have make a pros and cons list. Like these are, yes, these are the things that are good. These are the things that are bad, which, you know, we all throw away anyway. We don't use those pros and cons lists. We usually go into Sagittarius and Jupiter, even after we do that whole thing with, but I'm going to do this because it just feels right. Or there's something just more compelling about the whole story that that gets me on board. And how this is really also a prevalent talking point in like political theory, that, and we all, I think, have experienced this too, when you're talking with someone about a belief or trying to like change someone's mind about something, the facts, you can list all the evidence, you can give them all the facts, ain't gonna do a damn thing, because people, human beings, will always throw away that pros and cons list or listing all the facts, and the story and the narrative is just too powerful. You'll find people willing to die for certain stories or narratives with no facts to back them up. I think we've all seen that too. And so I think there's going to be something in there. Also, with Jupiter in Gemini, I'm thinking of pedagogues and devil's advocates. And culturally, I've noticed in some circles, if you start trying to, if you're saying, I'm just playing devil's advocate, you're trying to tease, you know, a certain theory or story open, people will kind of take offense to that. And I see that, I understand it when, like, I think we've all had probably this done to us, where someone's not really trying to understand us. They're just trying to do weird shit to our argument because they don't like it. But I think, you know, silencing people who play devil's advocate is not good in one sense, because we don't get that checking, but also depending on who's doing the devil's advocating and why they're doing it plays a huge part, because people can just like, especially people who have who are invested in certain more prevalent ways of seeing, try to pick apart like a new idea or a different idea. It's trying to really just pull it apart, not trying to build anything new. And so I think that'll come up. I'm borrowing this from a new favorite writer of mine. Her name is Jessica Wildfire. She has a Substack called OK Doomer, which blows me away. It's so
Nice.
smart. And she called the upcoming year basically possibilities on steroids, which I just loved. That made me think of Jupiter and Gemini. And one last thing, Alice Munro, who was an amazing writer who just passed, used this phrase: "My head was a magpie's nest lined with such bright scraps of information." And that's my experience with Mars and Gemini. It's just like, ooh, what's that? What's that? What's that? Oh, that's amazing. Like, I want them all. And I'm going to stop there. There is actually a lot more. But as far as Jupiter and Gemini, if any of those things forwarded anything you already had going on in your head, please share. Anybody?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, I
have
was
some.
gonna, I
Oh, go
think,
ahead.
no, I was gonna say, you get one of us going and it's gonna be another, yeah, I think we're all
We're all
entering.
just being polite Geminis. Like, who's gonna talk first?
Go ahead, Camille. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I just have like a litany of images too. Like, I guess like the way Gemini's approach prepping is just a whole bunch of bullet points. So I have like a few images or just one image for Jupiter and Gemini, and it plays nicely with what you've just said, Corey. But I imagine like, those game shows where you go into this machine that blows wind and money all around, and you're just trying to grab like as much as possible. Jupiter and Gemini reminds me of that, but it's like instead of grabbing at money, we're grabbing at information to like try to get as many facts so that we can create this cohesive story. And what we're left with in the end is still not the full picture, right? It's just like these little tidbits that we're getting, but we try to get as much as possible. I put here curiosity as adventure and choosing your own adventure. To be a tourist in your own city. So one thing that Gemini reminds me of is like our immediate familiar surroundings. And, Jupiter brings in this larger global context. And it's like this feeling of how can I see these very familiar things in like a more larger than life, like, Jupiterian perspective kind of way. And it just reminds me I'm like in a very popular city and I don't really see anything around here. So it just reminded me of like, why don't you actually go out there and, explore and see what's going on? I put the spiritual benefits of these side quests and tangents, and so how it can be productive and useful at times to like get off of the main track or get off the main narrative and, try to find other things or like and like things that are on the side that can contribute, I guess, like I said before, to like the larger story that is happening, and even how deviating a bit can like put some air or like give you like a break from whatever this dominant narrative is, and you can like gather other perspectives. And then the last thing that came up, and this is something that you were just talking about, Corey, I don't know if you've heard the phrase reply guy, which are people who just reply to things on social media in an intentionally mocking and condescending tone. Like, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Like, they're bad faith actors. They're not looking to get, they're not looking to be informed or to have a constructive dialogue. They're looking to get a rise out of you. And that is, unfortunately, a potential of Gemini. Just like playing around in that kind of mimicking way. But when it has to do with these larger issues, how that can create like its own, problem. So those are the main things that came to mind, if that stoked anything for anyone else.
Those are good. Those are really good, Camille. Shay, do you have anything to add?
I just want to say the expanding the question that you said, Corey, that to me feels like a slogan or spell for that. I mean, that just like went right in. I'm like, yes. Um, I mean, I was going to talk about the tarot correspondence. I don't know if this is a good time for that, or Mandee, if you wanted to jump in with more astrology specific things.
I'm happy to say stuff or listen. Yeah, right. Go ahead, Shay. I'd love to hear
Okay.
about the
Okay.
tarot.
Me
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
I'm going to take us
yeah.
on a little sidetrack here.
Yay.
On brand, on theme.
Exactly. Like taking Camille's cue here. I'm going to take us on a tangent. So, so the way that I'm talking about the astrological and tarot correspondences is using the framework of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I like. Just to be totally transparent, like I don't really super study in that framework, but when I talk about the correspondences, I use that framework. And so, so the minor arcana that corresponds to Jupiter and Gemini is the Eight of Swords. And I'm holding up an image from Pamela Coleman Smith, which shows a figure in a red dress, wrapped in bindings, blindfolded, surrounded by swords. And nobody's ever happy to see this image in a tarot reading. And so also thinking about Jupiter and Gemini, Jupiter is the wheel of fortune and Gemini is the lovers. And so I'm going to do a little visual performance, like quick notes of how Jupiter in Gemini is the Eight of Swords, how the Wheel of Fortune and the lovers gives you this. And so if you're listening, you might not get this. You have to sort of watch it on the YouTube. But if Gemini is and Jupiter is woo, you can kind of end up being like stuck, like short circuited. And that's the Eight of Swords. And so I just do want to Austin Coppock in 36 Faces frames this really well by saying about the Eight of Swords, a woman stands bound and blindfolded in the swampy ground, called Interference by Crowley in the Thoth deck. The Eight of Swords is a poor omen, betokening a situation where one is paralyzed by an overabundance of options. Excuse the ableist metaphor. It's, I'm sure you get the idea. So the way that I want to frame this, because I believe so strongly that every arcana has medicine and poison, I want to make sure to draw out the medicine in the Eight of Swords. So if we think about the Lover's card, Gemini, which originally in a much older deck was called the Choice, you know, that this is the place, the Lover's Arcana is where we begin recognizing our own preferences and desires, what we're attracted to and what we want. And we start to sort of exercise that power, right? And then the Wheel of Fortune, and I'm going to quote Jessa Crispin, who is the creator of the Spolia Tarot. She says about the Wheel of Fortune, here we come across the limits of our free will. This is everything that is outside of our control that we have to respond to rather than originate. And so you have this card of choices and you have this card of context and change, the things that we are not in control of, which is sort of represented by the Wheel of Fortune. And so you can take that situation of I am an actor with desires and preferences that I want to act on, and I'm in a context that I'm not in control of. And that can feel like this. And it can feel when we use our mind, right? So if the Eight of Swords is the strength of the mental aspect of our being, the strength of our mind, the other side of recognizing that situation is I live in a context that I don't control and I have choices. So it's bondage and liberation, like on sort of a razor's edge from one moment to the next. And it's the power that we have to use our mind to accept without resistance. And I'm not talking about political resistance. I'm talking about psychospiritual resistance, to not resist the context that we're in, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, the constraints that limit certain choices, and still understand that we are an actor making choices at all times. That is a liberatory inhabitation, or incantation or invitation or prescription of the Eight of Swords, is to not feel trapped by reality, but to understand where our agency lives inside reality. So that's how I wanted to talk about the Eight of Swords as being Jupiter and Gemini. I don't know if that's helpful or interesting or whatever, or even makes sense, but that's sort of how I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, very helpful. Wow. Yeah, like we're all kind of like silent here.
Yeah, because
Just
we're
like
taking it in and kind of just absorbing.
I
the
do have a little thought if it's a good time. I know.
Yeah.
Okay. This seed was planted, I think, Camille, when you were talking, and then Cory watered it. And then I'm glad we just went on that little side quest, Shay, because it helped me even inform this idea even more. But it's that when things feel big, or if we've been in a position of putting our faith outside of us or outside of our smaller worlds, what happens when we choose then to shift it more center and more local community focused. I feel like so often, and I'm touching again here on this like dogmatic idea that we were kind of talking about previously. So what happens when we become like less dogmatic about these big things, and kind of focus our attention a little bit closer and on our more immediate surroundings? And I think that's the Gemini. I hope that can be a Gemini Jupiter thing that we can play with through
I
this transit.
love that, Mandee. That's
Thanks.
yeah, when we pull out yeah, when we look at like the Gemini Sagittarius opposition, that Mercury Jupiter um axis, like Sagittarius is all of the experiences that are foreign, exotic, not familiar. We step, yeah, we make a long, journey or the quest to get outside or to get far away from what's familiar. And Gemini is like, what is right here in your localized environment, what's happening right now, not in the future, what's in front of your face. And to have those two in healthy relationship informing each other, so we're not like just like out into the future wanting to like have some completely otherworldly experience and expecting change from that, and to not be so hunkered down in only what's familiar. How, yeah, balancing that out. I'm going to borrow from Rick Levine again, like his ending, like farewell on all of his videos is,
Yeah.
think cosmically, act locally, like
Mm.
do both. They inform each other. That's a really good point, and such a beautiful illustration of this from the tarot, Shea. Thank you so
That was
much.
great.
And so that's a little bit about Jupiter and Gemini. It's going to be there for about a year. And so we really want to kind of put ourselves in that headspace, because I think that headspace is going to be a very busy headspace, and it might, just like in the image of the Eight of Swords, that's like being, being paralyzed by choice. And all of us here have Gemini placements, and I don't know about you all, but with my Gemini influences, choice is very difficult. When presented with choice, I usually don't make one. I'm like, I can do all of it. I'll figure out a way to do all of it. So because the feeling of making a sacrifice, which I'm not good with either, is too painful. I'm like, I have FOMO so bad. I'm going to miss out on one of these, experiences. I'm going to miss out on some knowledge because I'm committing to this thing. So I usually try to not make a choice, which I don't think is going to be a great idea this year. I think we're all going to have to make clearer choices this year, or else it's going to be too chaotic. Any thoughts about choice, having Gemini influences?
Yeah, well, just quickly, I wanted to piggyback off of what Mandee said because that was so impactful in thinking about how
Oh,
sometimes when Jupiter has like a mission or a crusade, there can be this larger than life feeling of like, I need to change the world, or how can I impact what is happening like across the ocean? But I think when Jupiter enters Gemini, we have more agency in terms of like, well, what are the things I can do right now in my community that make me feel like I'm contributing to change? And that reminded me a lot of these student protests, like at Columbia University and all of that. Like, what
yeah.
happens when we activate the community about things that feel out of our control and that are like foreign and like far away,
Mhm.
and how that can also be a productive way of like trying to save or heal or help versus this like huge, Sagittarian, like I gotta do it now, I gotta fix it all. But in terms of choices, Corey, what that reminded me of is how Jupiter will be in this prolonged square with Saturn in Pisces. And Saturn is that kind of influence of consolidating. And of course, Jupiter is like expanding. And it made me think of this. Someone else said, like, the word infrastructure, right? Do these big Jupiter ideas, plans, hopes, thoughts, whatever, actually have space in your life? Do you have time for them all? Priorities, which one is the most important? So not only is that something to preemptively go into this Jupiter in Gemini transit, like thinking about, but it's also something that we may be confronted with as Jupiter gets closer and closer and closer to Saturn. It's like, well, you actually can't have it all right now. You're gonna have to make some Saturnian sacrifices, right? Or cut back or pull back or get realistic about these larger than life Jupiter Gemini things that might be happening.
Uh,
Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
Shay,
y-
anything?
yeah, I mean, thinking about choices, I'm not, I should just say, like, I'm not an astrologer, I'm an enthusiast. And so I'm not speaking from that perspective. But, asking about choice, I think very much about, this being an election year and this big choice getting shoved down all of our throats of like Coke or Pepsi, and like the way that, certain kinds of choices are fetishized in the culture, like the choice about like what brand of toothpaste and what kind of car you drive,
Yeah.
and like, but not, as I'm just going to say, like Dana Lynn Knuckles says all the time about, we're not able to choose about whether we sell our labor to meet our survival needs. That's not a choice. That's an imperative. And so just thinking about like, and there's one last thing I want to say about this related to the Eight of Swords. Amanda Yates Garcia did an episode with the writer and organizer and activist Sarah Schulman on the Suit of Swords, which was amazing. Highly recommend. And in talking about the Eight of Swords, Sarah Schulman told a story that she heard. I don't know if she heard it personally from Andrea Dworkin or heard about it, but Andrea Dworkin, who's a second wave feminist, told this story of three women trapped under a boulder. And the first woman has like bloody fingers from like trying to like get this boulder off her chest. And the second woman is like, I love my boulder. And the third woman's like, what boulder? And I think there's something about like actually being real about what are the conditions, like what is actually happening, like having a choice of chaos fascism or respectability fascism, like recognizing that you know, thinking that that is a choice is kind of saying like, what rock? That's the connection that I'm making, is that like, what are the actual choices that we have? Where are we actually able to exercise? And I see that in the student encampments. I see it in the Palestinian resistance. I see it in, people who are making choices that are costing them, to actually stand up for something. So I think the idea of like, what is a real choice that we have and what is sort of a false fetishized choice that we're presented with.
Mm, that's all. Yeah. Um, yes. And since you bring up the word fascism, in my mind, because I'm not a tarot practitioner, but there's a card. I think it's in the Wands suit. It might be the Ten of Wands that is connected to. Is it the Ten of Wands that's connected to fascism?
Say more.
I think I may have heard this from you.
Oh my
Um,
God.
but there's
It's possible.
going back to the dogma and the dogmatic that Mandee brought up, the opposing sign of Gemini, Sagittarius, can can go in an all-encompassing fascist direction. It can go all in on a principle. And oftentimes, we get fired up on ideas and principles and they bring people together, but we forget that these groups of people are actually all individuals. But if you tap into one idea that makes something true, Sagittarius for a whole group of people, and they're using that to like maybe self-identify and really invest their ego in, again, they will die for this
Yeah.
principle that may or may not be true, relevant, actually good for everybody, but you can get a movement going. And this is where Gemini can come in and ask the questions. Wait, hold on. Can we check this? Can we break this down and see what's real here? Can we engage as individuals and compare notes instead of just like, I'm gonna go all in with this fire and this dogma? And I
Yeah,
could have swore it was the Ten of Wands, but maybe
I don't know, but as I hear you talking about it, makes me think of Mercury in Sagittarius, which is the Eight of Wands, and sort of a message that gets like, the Eight of Wands is about swiftness, about acceleration, about sort of something coming in from the outside and moving really quickly. And I think about that, like what you're saying is a message getting picked up and sort of moved with a group of people and something accelerating, which I feel like we are totally seeing, for sure.
yeah, in all different expressions, for all different kinds of ideas. And when Jupiter moves into Gemini, it won't be too long before it makes a trine with Pluto and Aquarius. And it's going to pull in all these new Pluto and Aquarius stories about the collective and large groups of people and new ways to organize ourselves socially, organize ourselves using technology. It and we have two air signs. It's Aquarius and Gemini. This is very heady stuff. It's immaterial and therefore can move very fast. And so I think there's that component with Jupiter moving into Gemini. And for those of you astro nerds, yes, Gemini is the sign of Jupiter's detriment. It's not supposed to like, quote unquote, be happy there or do well there, which I don't really subscribe to. It just does what it does there, for better and worse. But yeah, like if Jupiter tends to be more comfortable with these bigger ideas, the bigger picture, conviction, belief, and then to put it in a sign that's really interested in the fluidity between things, the both and of things, Jupiter might get a little annoyed with that, a little uncomfortable, but also could give Gemini all these little details and facts and talking points some coherence and meaning, because that's what Jupiter also confers. And because all of you have done some divination work, when you have like a beginning astrologer or a beginning tarot practitioner, what you'll see them do is they'll be like, okay, Venus is in Taurus, that means that. Your rising sign is this, that means that. We pulled this card, that means that. That's Gemini, right? All the pieces. But if you were to bring Jupiter into that Gemini space and cohere, synthesize, formulate a narrative as a whole, a thesis statement, then you have you have that powerful narrative that can move mountains and move, large groups of people, because that's how powerful stories are. We've been living off them for centuries. That's why we even have these practices. These are narrative building practices that catalyze actuality and movement. And speaking of all these Gemini things, Shay's been chatting away. I just want to like read some of the things in the chat. Remixing dominant narratives, opposition as a type of relationship versus that's not me. The devil doesn't need an advocate. Marginalized lives are not an abstract thought experiment, and we are storytelling animals. Absolutely. Did you want to say something, Mandee?
No, I was just I didn't realize
You
there
were
was a
just
chat situation going, so I was just, yeah. Sorry, Shay.
so another great example of Gemini, like multiple streams of information coming in. Um, okay, so that's some of Jupiter in Gemini, what you can, some things to think about over the next year. And then going back to the transit, June 3rd, Mercury enters Gemini. That's Mercury's home sign, very comfortable there, can move around, ask all the questions. Um, we've been talking a lot about Gemini, but does anyone want to add anything about Mercury being comfortable with all these other planets in Gemini?
I have this natally. My chart ruler is Gemini and Mercury. Yeah, Mercury and Gemini. And that was a very Gemini Mercury moment. I feel like there's so many thoughts flowing through my brain at one time that I may mix up words or I may say the wrong word. And I think that can be overwhelming, both as a person with that natally, but then also if you're not used to having that in your world or in your mind. Before we jumped on and before I like actually joined, I had the thought, I was like, did I have too much coffee or am I just like tapping into that Gemini thing? Because it can feel very buzzy and very swift and quick to change. And I think that if we have found that we've maybe been a little dogmatic in our thought processes before, or how we think about how we process or the connections that we make, it's a really good time to allow space for that to change and like allow it to change on the fly and not hold any one thought too firmly, because you may change your mind the moment the thought leaves your mouth, and that's okay. It's generally, and I think that's where Gemini gets the like two-faced or the what are some of the other like cliche negative things that people say, like there's the two-faced thing and they can't make up their mind, and it's like maybe, but it's also there's a lot going on and there's a lot of things informing those thoughts and the processes and the connections that we're making. So yeah, that's my
A
little,
made-up mind is so boring.
it's
Why would you want that?
yes,
I want to keep
yes,
exploring, keep putting things together.
figuring out how things work, why they work. If yeah, it's yeah, I can't imagine like waking up one day and being like, I've made up my mind. This is it. This is all I ever have to think about for the rest. I genuinely, and it's taken me all of my 36 years to realize that not everyone has that ability or that like way to process information. I'm like, why are you not adapting? Or like, why didn't that move you or change your mind? And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think we live in a society that is allergic, or rather, let me reframe, a society that praises conviction. Like, oh, we love people that are sure of themselves, and we want experts to, we hold them to a higher standard, right? And we generally just live in a society that is like pro specialists and not really pro generalists, which is what I think my Gemini nature is, like multivalent. I'm doing a lot of things. So yeah, there is this, I guess taboo or even shame story around Gemini in terms of like, well, I do have the right to change my mind. It doesn't mean I was dumb or stupid. It means that I have access to more information now, and that changed my thoughts. Like, it's okay to change your mind this Jupiter in Gemini season. Maybe what you thought you knew, maybe the convictions you held are challenged, and that can be disorienting, but it can also be fun. Now you have more chapters. Like the book isn't over. I don't know. We're all biased because we're all Gemini heavy.
Yeah, I love that changeability, and we like vilify it.
Mhm.
I think when Mandee, when you were saying, oh, two-faced and something else, like in pop astrology, people will just straight up say, Gemini's a liar. And and because, whatever they said they believed yesterday, if you talk to them today, then they might say something different, and it's like, you're lying. or that you're two-faced or you're a hypocrite or something like that, which can be true. Again, if you are intentionally messing around with the facts and the details, again, usually to fit another Sagittarian story that you want to present, then yeah, not good. But if you're consciously, it's like, I know I said that yesterday, but in light of new information, in light of how I feel today, I'm thinking this, and to be able to like ride that wave. But definitely like Gemini, like I used to have a trouble with fibbing and like bending details to fit a story that I wanted. I'm totally over it now. But also like same like just outing myself. I used to have a problem with gossiping. It's like I always want to know the tea. Like if I haven't seen you
Yeah.
for a while, I'll usually come to you with tell me everything, leave out nothing. I want what happened, what's happening now. Like I want to know the new thing, the new idea, the new piece of information. Um, and I have Mars and Gemini, so that can go a little on its head sometimes, especially the past couple of weeks. I had to stop feeding my brain so much news because I always wanted to know. There's so much now. I was like, well, what's happening now? Because I know in the next hour there's going to be another thing. And I got a little crazy, and then it started giving me anxiety. So I'm taking a little break. But there's that, like, well, what, like, I need to know how things have changed in the last hour, so I know what I'm thinking now. Because I'm in relationship with that kind of movement. But it can have its downside, like the flip flop. Um, when you are not, let's say Gemini is like a seesaw. If you're constantly running to one end of the seesaw, you're going to feel incomplete because you're ignoring the other end. And then you run to the other end of the seesaw, and then that doesn't feel quite right. And I think when Gemini is really successful is when you can stand in the middle of the seesaw, the fulcrum, and then you are not being dictated by this piece of knowledge and then this piece of knowledge that seems like it's opposite. You're standing in the middle of the seesaw at the fulcrum, and you're in control of both, and you're kind of blending it in real time as the weight shifts or as you want it to shift. Maybe you do want things to be a little, you know, on further in one direction than the other, but you understand that the two sides are the whole and they're in constant movement with Gemini. And so you got to move with it. And I think that's a more accurate expression of whatever might quote unquote be really going on. Otherwise you will get this, flip flop thing, and people will tell you you're flaky and you said this other thing the other day and I can't trust you, that whole. So that with some consciousness, Gemini is just really brilliant and fascinating. It's like when you hold a multifaceted, gem up to the light, and you can look at all the different facets as you let the light hit it in different places.
Can
Wow.
I say a couple things about that? Actually, the
Yeah.
fulcrum image really makes me think of the Temperance Arcana, and which corresponds with Sagittarius, actually. So, thinking about Jupiter as having the space, the capacity to hold extremity and change and contradiction. And as we live through a time where the contradictions are like becoming so sharp and so unbearable in certain ways, I think that, that's something else maybe that Jupiter and Gemini is speaking to, is dilating our capacity to hold contradiction, and to also think about, there's the medicine of like being able to like learn in public and change our minds based on new information. I feel like that's a sign of maturity. And I also want to like just hold it down over here for conviction, because there are certain things that have absolute conviction about that are not going to change. And this moment is actually sharpening that for me. Like there are certain things that are not debatable for me anymore, if they ever were, which I don't think they were, but like there are certain hills I will absolutely die on. I think knowing what those are in these times is helpful. Um, and we can see the poison of conviction, you know, based on, you know, wrong information or based on whatever. The last little point I want to make about thinking about Jupiter and Gemini is who's controlling the narrative. This is I've been studying counterinsurgency, and you can download the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, which was created by the Joint Armed Forces and academics and non-governmental organizations and media, mainstream media. People were invited in to contribute to the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, and you can download it for free online. And shout out to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. I did a study group with them on the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And a huge part of counterinsurgency, which is everything that is trying to stabilize and keep legitimate these institutions that are wreaking so much havoc in our world. That is counterinsurgency. You're like, well, where can I find a counterinsurgency narrative? Open any mainstream newspaper or news outlet. That is counterinsurgency. And so there was just a story in the Washington Post the other day about a WhatsApp group filled with about 100 different leading business people, billionaires and millionaires. And this started last fall after Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, where they basically got together and was like, okay, how are we going to control this narrative? And basically tilt the narrative to, you know, basically tell Israel's side of the story and why this is important and so on and so forth. So again, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism has a whole episode about this, which is really great. They break down the whole article. But what I want to say about it is there's a lot of like Twitter noise about that story right now, about like Eric Adams, you know, received campaign contributions but that's not the story. The story is that this group of people with billions of dollars between them got together to explicitly control the narrative about what happened, right? And that the way that the media and even social media is telling the story is to, number one, throw Eric Adams under the bus, which I am here for every day of the week, and also who gets thrown under the bus, actually, when it comes down to it. And that this will start to spin into a story about creating a conspiracy about Jewish people, right? And anti-Semitism. But the undisputed fact of the matter, people have copped to being in the WhatsApp group, like none of the facts are in dispute. So I say all of this to say, who is controlling the narrative? Like Cory said earlier, like stories are everything. We are made of stories. Our life is made of stories. And so Jupiter and Gemini is like, who is controlling the narrative? And when we see these students in these encampments who have been trained to get in front of the media and stay on message, this is about Palestine, right? To see like, how are we taken in? How do we see what's happening behind the scenes? Who's pulling the strings, so on and so forth. So I think that's another way to thank you for listening to that very long digression, but I think it's really an interesting thing to watch right now, especially.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Shay. And this is another example of this isn't just your garden variety Jupiter and Gemini. It just got radicalized by Uranus, and now that is part of this current Jupiter's makeup for the next 14 years. This is a long story that we are at the beginning of, and Jupiter wants to expand and change the established narrative because what Uranus does is it interrupts the established order. So when those two came together in April, that is the very inception of how are we going to successfully, or what's that effort going to look like, disrupt the established order of all of these Jupiterian things: higher education, government, law, philosophies, worldviews. This is geopolitical. That, and we're just at the beginning, so everyone, endurance. don't shoot your wad in a week, because this is going to require sustained energy, like the volatility that we're in right now. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that sharing.
I wanted to add one thing, and it's kind of a blend of what Shay just went through and you, Corey, about like all the noise that's happening, and you can expect the volume to be turned up to dizzying levels when Jupiter enters Gemini. But it reminded me, of the importance of like having a conviction and having an opinion, because if you don't have
Yeah.
that kind of like stake in the ground, you're just going to get blown about. And it's not even like there's this story and then the other story. It's also like, as you said, like the tributaries, this opinion about this story, the opinion about the opinion about the opinion about the opinion. And so it's very important to know like where you are, because there can be, as a Mars and Gemini native, this like, what do I actually think? I've just been feeding off like, all the abundant information that is around. And if you don't kind of have that center, maybe it's a moral center, maybe it's an opinion, a thought, whatever, you can just really get blown to pieces, right? And just get flip-flopped, whichever way the wind happens to blow. And you can expect that in Gemini, the winds are going to be winding. So,
Yeah, that's a good point, Camille. And so I think Mandee just put up 29 Taurus, which is, but we have stuff going on there right now. Um, is I had some thoughts when I saw that, but Mandee, did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's I'm formulating thoughts. The reason why I said it was because that's 29 degrees is a big degree, any sign, any planet, any, right? But I think that this is offering some assistance to that, like getting clear. What do I value? What do I believe? How, like it's there to help lean on, I think, and it to help. This is what I have conviction about, or this is where I'm going to be dogmatic in my life, or these are the values that I will not budge on. And so, yeah, that's as far as I've gotten so far. Corey, what were you?
That's so I was gonna say, during these last this show is probably gonna come out next week. But or what is today? Yeah,
I
it'll
don't
probably come
know.
out next week. But that's why, that's a benefit of having Taurus come before Gemini. Just getting It's a time to get clear on your values. Where will you not budge? What are some things that you're going to hold true no matter what? And then you can go into Gemini season, and just kind of, I think Camille used the word garnish. And then maybe like, oh, you maybe do a little reshaping here and a little reshaping there as information comes to light, which Jupiter and Gemini, there's going to be a lot of new information. So just like basic values, like, don't kill people. All right, okay, now we're in Gemini, and but what about in this situation, and what if it's like this, and what, like, okay, well, but don't kill people. Just some like, and then you can entertain, you can do all the mental gymnastics of Gemini, and it won't spin you out, because you'll at least have some kind of embodied sense of like what is there's got to be some stability. I do believe that there is a core in everyone, whether it's a mental core, emotional core, philosophical core, and then to not get rigid, like what Taurus can do sometimes, then you play around with Gemini and you shape it. But I don't think that core, like you can't just like transplant and say like, oh, this whole core of who I am or what I believe. I don't believe that anymore. Let me get a new core. Like I don't think it works that way. Um, so yeah. And speaking of, we're getting now back into placements. There are three of us here that have Mars in Gemini on, and Mandee, you have Venus in Gemini and Mercury. And I'm wondering, for anyone else who has Mars in Gemini, does anyone want to talk a little bit about their experience? Because Mandee talked a little bit about Venus in Gemini.
Yeah, I'll go. Speaking of like really crucial degrees, mine is at 0 degrees of Gemini. And so I kind of relate to that as being like fresh out of Taurus. I'm really willing to explore, right? Any and everything. So this kind of like naivete. Um, I honestly love having Mars in Gemini. I think it makes me like a deft mover and actor, especially like in the information age. I think it's kind of like an asset and a protection even to have Mars in Gemini in terms of speaking up or resisting via information. But I had my own existential crisis about Mars and Gemini, and I was talking about this with Cory, I think before Mandee and Shea joined, in terms of like, am I just a dilettante? Like, am I just here to just sample many different things and like the internalized shame around like not having a straightforward path? Because Mars, again, gets into the nooks and crannies when it's in Gemini. And so I would say it's like it's a whirlwind. It's incredibly fun. It Mars through Gemini has helped me collect information that I otherwise would not have, looked into, and it makes life interesting and dynamic. But there's certainly a lot of drawbacks, and especially what you said, Cory, about anxiety. This is a malefic planet in the sign of the mind. And so all the inflammation that can occur mentally. But I guess with any placement, really, it's like, some good and some bad. So yeah, that's generally my experience. And it's right on my ascendant. So I feel like it's leading my life in a lot of ways. Like it's a very loud actor in terms of my natal promise.
I can relate. How about you, Shay?
Well, I just want to thank Camille because I feel like Camille was the first astrologer that I've had a natal chart consultation with who actually devoted a fair bit of attention to that placement for me. I have Mars and Gemini in Mars's decan in the 12th house. So, of course, I lived in a monastery for a decade and had sat with my inflamed mind on my cushion for many, many years. And the anxiety is real. The constant movement of the mind is real. Mars and Gemini is the 9 of Swords, and no one likes to see that. And that is like a card that I, according to Austin Coppock's framework, am meant to like master in this life. And I think that that's a daily struggle and is happening all the time. I was just talking to my previous tarot study cohort right before I hopped on here about um, Mars and Gemini, that 10 years ago, Mars and Gemini manifested as extreme reactivity and an ability to absolutely flay people verbally in the most like, acupuncture needle kind of way. And that has transformed as I am goddess blessed maturing into a sort of ferocious curiosity. So I think that Oh my gosh, Camille, back in high school, like we could talk about it. It was like legendary. And I think about like all the damage I did to people,
Yeah.
really, really hurting people. Like, but there was so much satisfaction in it in the moment. As sick as that is to say, that was like part of it. But that Mars transforming into a really from aggression to a kind of ferocity of curiosity, being
Mm.
ferociously curious, being very um, having a lot of using questions to get into things instead of verbally flaying someone. It's like I just reach for a question, and that can be as really much more potent of a weapon actually than because the question turns someone back. They have to sort of say the thing themselves than instead of having me say it. So that's something that's come, I'm almost 50, so it's taken a long time for that to calm down. But I also just want to speak to the whole like dilettante thing. Like, oh my God, I don't know if I realized like how much that's part of Mars and Gemini. Like that is me a kajillion percent. And I just really like feel very in good company and affirmed that like I follow my enthusiasms. Like I am not going to like dig myself into 100-foot hole and stay there for the rest of my life. That's just like not the life I want to live. So here's to dispelling all shame about being interested in all of the things.
Yes, I love it. I relate to all of that too. Yeah, I have Mars in Gemini too, and it's early degrees, so I'm going to be getting a Jupiter hit on top of that. And the way it's manifested for me is I've I've always had like 10 projects going on at the same time, and everyone's asking like, how do you juggle all that? And back to, I'm not really juggling. I'm doing maybe one or two things in a lot of different languages. Um, and I love that you brought in immature Mars and Gemini and, and more mature Mars and Gemini. I've had to work with it. Like I used to have a gossip problem. I used to have a lying, cheating, and stealing problem. Again, young Gemini, right? Because like Mercury, that's thieves and liars and shady people too, to
Mhm.
be, to bring it all in. Um, and then I found ways to channel it. Luckily, I developed a writing practice and I studied a lot. I did a lot of school. I just not because I was trying to like get a bunch of degrees or anything. I just really liked being in school because there was a lot of reading, a lot of discourse, a lot of talking, and I liked being in that atmosphere. I teach and I speak and I write for a living, and I spent several years as an art critic, and I still work with artists. And I'm kind of like, in the mafia, they have the cleaner. Like they bring me into a rehearsal process, and it's like, why this, why that, why not this? How about bring in this? Don't do that, do this. Like I'm cutting and pasting and trying to figure out, different ways to put things together and helping the artist that way. And about the verbal flaying, and I have, my Mars and Gemini rules my moon in Scorpio. I know exactly where it hurts. I know exactly where to poke. That's going to make you fold. Now, do I use it that way because I know exactly where to get you, or because I know exactly where to get you, can I open up some really healing spaces very quickly and very deeply,
Yeah.
by using language? So that's how I've been doing it. It sits with Saturn, so luckily it slows me down a little bit. And I also have, I have a internalized aversion to it as well. Um, it's like I do Gemini things, but it's not, maybe not as fun. It's serious Gemini. We're going to define this and give this a shape. And also, but there's shame too, because again, it's shame comes when like who we are doesn't match with whatever is approved of. And like like, I don't think anybody here is really a dilettante. um I can study very deeply. I can go deep really fast, and I can synthesize. I'm usually reading like 5 books at the same time, but in my head, as I'm reading all 5, again, it's not compartmentalized. It's like one book made of because like that's how my mind works. And it doesn't mean I'm, a lightweight, which I've heard that word before for Gemini. I hate it. um it's being virtuosic in a different way. Again, like you were saying, Camille, it's like, are you a specialist? Are you an expert at this? I think Gemini is an expert in being able to put it all together and work with a lot of moving parts. It's a different type of expertise.
I wonder,
So
do you feel like it makes you a like that it helps you in like delineating chart? Like, because so much it seems like of delineating a chart is doing that synthesis, and just interesting, the Mars placements,
and I
here.
think everyone who has Gemini here can attest to it. Means that you can look at a card formation, a layout, or a natal chart, and I'm like, okay, here's the 10 ways I see this. You can go this way, you can go that way, you can go this way, you can go that way. And then once you meet the person, it's like, then you can kind of narrow it down in your mind. Okay, I'm going to give them like a couple options, because I got the options here. Because the mind actually works better, I've found. Like, I've tried to do what I was supposed to do. Like, I'm going to focus on this, and mine just doesn't work that way. And
No,
it
yeah.
yeah, I need 10 things to focus on
Another
for
thing
it
I
to
really
focus.
love about Mars and Gemini in terms of like synthesis, they come from such a place, like I'm not talking about me. They come from such a place of non-judgment. It's this feeling of like, isn't this fascinating? Isn't this interesting? It's interesting. Like, let's unravel this thread. There's never, a kind of judgment or a kind of like, value placed on it, because to Gemini, it's like, this is just information to me. Um, and in terms of what like Shay just put in the chat, like the support specifically that I got from my mom about being so multivalent, like she let me try a sport, quit a sport, try a sport, quit a sport, this camp, that camp. She really just indulged my desire to just collect a whole bunch of experiences. And she has her own Mars and Aries, and you were talking about that sextile before, where it's like, yeah, let's do it. But yeah, just having that validation that it's okay not to have to do life in a straight line.
Mm, I love that, because the truth of the matter is, life is not linear, time is not linear. It just doesn't. I think that's a truth. We invented linear time. That is a manufactured thing that we have agreed upon, social consensus, Saturn, to do. Wow, that was a lot of Gemini. I just want to say that as Gemini season progresses, we get another big shift right before we head into Cancer season, which might be a relief to some of you, like just exhausted from all that movement. Um, and to finish off Gemini season, we get Mars going into Taurus on the 9th. That is going to slow some things down, bring us back into, like, maybe even it's Mars. We might be fighting for what we value, trying to stabilize all that got kicked up in Aries season, that Gemini started like making its inquiries into. Mars might be like, hold on, I need to like build a case. I need to build a story. And then Venus and Mercury enter Cancer and conjoin at, I think, 0 degrees Cancer on June 17th. Another big shift from all this airy movement into the heart space, the feelings, maybe wanting to withdraw a little bit. not be out there buzzing around. And then we get the summer solstice on June 20th. And so again, we're getting these like hard twists and turns as things change. It doesn't feel very gradual. So prep yourself for that. We're going to end with any last thoughts and any last pitches. If any of you have stuff coming up or just want to say something in conclusion, you're welcome.
I'll go first. I don't have any pitches or anything. I just wanted to thank you guys for being here with me, inviting me to do this, Cory. This has been so good, and it's been Gemini good in a very like refined way. And so I'm looking forward to welcoming in the season with this little chat we've had. So thank you.
Thank you, Mandee.
Yeah, I just like thank you so much. If this is like a peak experience to like get together and do this. I will say I have asking good questions. I don't know if this will make it out in time for that. It's happening this coming Thursday, but you can check out all my tarot classes. I have a new study cohort that's starting in September from the beginning. So if people are interested in that, and really just feel like so grateful to be talking about the most important things with the coolest people.
Oh, Shay, and like, let's not forget, Shay has a book
Yeah.
that is about questions and tarot. It's a big, beautiful book about questions and tarot. So that fits in very nicely with Gemini season. If you're studying tarot, doing your practice, I highly recommend Shay's work. And Camille, anything? What do you got to say?
Nothing that I didn't already share in the beginning. So you can find me on the interwebs. If anything, you could just expect inconsistency from me. I don't know what I have coming up except for this conference in September that I haven't prepped for at all. But yeah, I'm on the internet. I'm book a reading, read some of my insights. I'm constantly putting out little tidbits or little astrological snacks on my social media pages, so people can tune in to get a little
Your
sample of that.
stories are the best, Camille. Your little tangents. Oh, I love it. It's like, it's seriously like one of the 4 things keeping me on Instagram these days.
Aw,
Camille's
thank
stories.
you.
So
Yeah, I'm on Twitter for Camille, basically. That's why I'm
Aw,
so on
yes,
Twitter.
my Gemini heart.
No, Camille had like I usually check stories in the morning with my morning coffee. And so it's kind of like how I would imagine if I were grabbing coffee with Camille and she was just telling me she's just
Listen,
telling me
yeah.
stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah.
Just random stuff too. They don't tie together. Tune in.
it's the best.
Thank you.
But yeah, I love Camille's stories too. Wow, and then I just want to thank all of you for being here and hashing out this Gemini season. This is really important for me to do so I don't get, so I don't get locked into only talking with clients and students. So this is such a wonderful place for me to have like colleague time, and I really appreciate each of you so much. And for everyone listening to this, I hope this gives you some grist for the mill as we have this like this is a just unprecedented time in life, the changes that we are going through so quickly. um, I hope the astrology gives you some kind of framework that helps you work with things as they unfold. And for those of you who do study astrology, hope this gave you some interesting things to play with during Gemini season in your mind. And with all of that said, I'm going to sign off. And also in the show notes, there will be everyone's information so you can check out everyone's offerings and learn more about them. So until next time, take care and I'll see you later.